On Jacob's way back to the ethereal summit, Snowflake was seen across the sky. As Mystic Set noticed the return of the senior, they immediately sent out an invitation. "Kathy, why don't you take Grandma to Mystic Sect for a visit?" Jacob asked cheerfully. Sure," Kathy agreed as she gently held Grandma up and seated themselves horizontally on Snowflake's back. With fire ejecting from its claws, Snowflake steadily ascended into midair and flew towards Mystic Sect. Upon seeing the arrival of the snow line, the sect master of the Mystic Sect understood that the seniors from the valley accepted her invitation and became ecstatic. Soon, with the help of a beautiful female cultivator in her chi refinement realm, an elder that released no aura at all set foot onto the Mystic Sect. From the shape that the elder was in, Elder Emily firmly believed that she was a master cultivator on the nascent soul realm, who already achieved complete mind tranquility. Therefore, the sect master did not dare to neglect her, and promptly received them with utmost respect and consideration. As for Jacob, who stayed behind in the valley, he was helping Sophie understand the Big Dipper constellation scroll they had just acquired. The Big Dipper constellation scroll was divided into 7 chapters, and each was named after one of the 7 stars in the constellation. The cultivation technique commanded the power of the Big Dipper constellation, and it contained elegant and graceful sword techniques, very suitable for new cultivators. Furthermore, as the cultivation strength increased, the power of the sword techniques would improve exponentially. All in all, it was a simple cultivation technique that allowed ample room for growth. The more Sophie looked at it, the fonder she became of this cultivation technique. She even felt that it was a custom-made cultivation technique for her. As Jacob flicked through the technique, he suddenly found that it was missing the last 3 chapters. "Sophie, this cultivation technique is not complete," Jacob stated as he rolled up the cultivation technique. "How come?" Sophie looked at Jacob in surprise. "Well, there are 7 chapters in total, yet we only have the first 4 here. The 3 that are the higher levels are missing." "What?" Sophie was completely in shock for a moment. Soon, she became livid. "That girl! How dare she fool me?" "Since it is incomplete, you shouldn't try to cultivate it anymore. I'll find you a more reliable cultivation technique on 5th Heaven," Jacob sighed. "No way. I like this one," Sophie responded determinedly. Clutching the longsword, Sophie said, "This is the one I will cultivate. When the time comes, I will go to 6th Heaven and seize the last 3 chapters." Jacob couldn't help but respond with a chuckle. This was the first time that he was seeing Sophie to be so passionate about her cultivation, and it was a welcome change. He admired her determination and didn't want to dishearten her. So he decided that, if needed, he will go there with Sophie to get her the remaining chapters. Start with the first chapter then. Since this sword can't be stored in your storage ring yet, you should just keep it in your cave here at Ethereal Summit and cultivate the technique here, Jacob said. "Got it. In 3 months, I will defeat that girl by myself for sure." All of a sudden, Sophie's motivation heightened. She opened the Big Dipper constellation scroll to the first page and began studying it meticulously. Just like that, Sophie, who was from 1st Heaven, and Alina, who was from 6th Heaven, had now become Nemesis. One vowed to obtain the other half of the Big Dipper constellation scroll, and the other swore to get her treasure sword back. However, at the moment, Sophie didn't have the ability nor the courage to confront Alina on 6th Heaven, and Alina also had no way of finding Jacob and Sophie's hiding place on 5th Heaven. Sophie was mad because Alina was arrogant and ordered her spirit beast to attack others carelessly. Also, she was mad that Alina cheated them and only gave them half of the cultivation technique. On the other hand, Alina was angry because the treasure sword was her most cherished treasure. She was even more upset than Sophie could imagine. It took a lot of effort for her to convince her father to gift her that sword, since it was a top-tier treasure. As for the Big Dipper constellation scroll, it was obtained from a prominent elder by her father using his sect master status and great treasures. It was a great cultivation technique from 7th Heaven. Needless to say, it was of incredibly high value, even though there was still an original copy of the Big Dipper constellation scroll at the Sky Mountain sect. It was a cultivation technique acquired at the cost of 6 top-tier snow lotuses, 2 level 4 snow lines, and the pride of the sect master of the Sky Mountain sect. Losing it to Jacob and Sophie with nothing in return upset and angered Alina greatly. Time passed quickly. Now, Sophie had memorized the first chapter, which was the simplest of them all. She was not aware of the fact that this was a cultivation technique from 7th Heaven. All she noticed was that it was easier and more straightforward than the one she had cultivated before she lost her dragon core. Moreover, it had more variations available. Snowflake descended slowly from the sky after going to the mystic sect, and Grandma looked like she was in a great mood, with a healthy glow on her cheeks. "Time to go back," Jacob called out. Consumed by thoughts of his own, Noah was just lying on the grass when he heard the call. Immediately, he got up and tossed out the black disc for Grandma to ride on. Snowflake briskly went around the valley and took Jacob and Sophie onto its back. They burst out of the valley in the array formation on 5th Heaven. Within moments, they had returned to their picnic spot. With a pleasant glow on her face, Grandma lay on the big rock and continued the nap. Moments later, Walter, who had caught more than a dozen butterflies, and Mila, who was holding more than a dozen sealed-off small test tubes, returned to the car. "We walked a little too far. That's why we got back so late. You must have been waiting so long. Come, it's picnic time," Walter announced as he carefully put away the bottles containing butterflies in the car. Rubbing her eyes, Grandma sat up slowly and was confused. "Mom, how come your face is so red?" Mila was concerned as she walked over and helped Grandma stand herself. "I fell asleep on the sun and had a fascinating dream. In it, I flew to the sky and into a place where immortals lived. There was a gorgeous palace and a beautiful valley. The people in the palace all addressed me as a senior, and they offered me delicious wines and food. A few of them performed a sword dance together, and it was phenomenal." Grandma took in a deep breath as she recalled the events in her dream and described them expressively. "Mom, you must have slept too much," Walter said with a chuckle. "Sophie, Jacob, Noah, and Kathy were all in the dream. I even taught Kathy how to build a plastic greenhouse," Grandma added. Walter shook his head helplessly as he turned to look at Jacob and the others. "And Snowflake, it became this big in the sky." Grandma glanced at Snowflake, who was by her feet while she gestured with her arms. Snowflake lifted its head and looked at Walter and Grandma with its big, innocent eyes. After all, it was only as big as a palm with its 4 small golden paws, a night and day difference from what Grandma had just described. "Mom, it's definitely the best feeling to have sweet dreams while bathing in the sun." Walter helped Grandma onto the picnic spot carefully. Then he turned and shouted at Jacob, "Put out the picnic blanket and take out the food." "Got it," Jacob answered, and began taking everything out of the car. The recovery Grandma gained from staying 2 hours in 5th Heaven far exceeded the results of hour-long nursing by Jade and Julia. As a guest at the Mystic Sect, she was served the best spirit wine and best spirit fruit. No ordinary mortal could ever receive such treatments. Since Walter and Mila were busy preparing for the picnic, they did notice that Grandma seemed 10 years younger than before after the nap. Her wrinkles were gone, and she became more agile. The sun was shining brightly, while the fragrance of flowers filled the area. They were all seated on the picnic blanket, and Walter took out the sandwiches and fruits from the basket one by one. The atmosphere was so refreshing that it set everyone's minds at ease. Having a picnic while immersed in nature was an entirely different feeling than dinner at home. The easiness that one felt from being able to eat while sitting on the grass, enjoying the clouds in the sky, was definitely impossible to obtain from eating at home. Occasionally, Draken and Helen would take Sophie on adventures in the wild as well. However, they had never taken her out for a picnic, because they felt like a 3-person picnic was underwhelming in comparison to a larger picnic. Since Sophie acquired a handy weapon by chance today, she was thrilled and overjoyed. Drenched in the sunlight in the valley, The bright smile on her face became even more dazzling. While eating, Jacob couldn't help but stare at Sophie and become lost in a stupor of admiration. Noticing that, a meaningful smile appeared on Mila's face. Indeed, Sophie looked exceptionally stunning today. If Sophie weren't already her future daughter-in-law, Mila would want to make Sophie her daughter instead. Hey! At this moment, two crisp and clear voices resonated in the area at once. Jade and Julia! How come you're here too? Grandma asked as she was pleasantly surprised by their appearance. The weather is so nice, and we decided to come here for a hike as well. It is nice that we ran into you guys, Jade replied with the sweetest smile possible. Maintaining their synchronized movements, they both sat down and tidied their hats, proving that they were indeed here for an outing. Grandma took out 2 plates and said, What a coincidence! Come, sit down and eat with us. Thanks, Grandma. Jade and Julia did not object. They grabbed the plates and began tasting the dishes displayed on the picnic blanket with smiles on their faces. Grandma, there was a citywide siren last night for a hurricane warning. It was so frightening, Julia said to Grandma after they started eating. At least you were in the city. We were by the ocean when that happened. That was certainly something else, Grandma replied while laughing. Jade and Julia nodded their heads at Grandma's remark. This morning, the streets were full of fishes and shrimps, all washed up from the ocean by the hurricanes, Julia said. According to the news, it was fortunate that the alarm went off at midnight. Even the crazy winds caused by the hurricanes didn't cause any casualties, Jade added. Since the alarm and the siren were the results of an urgent phone call made by Mila was pleased to hear what Jade and Julia said. Weather forecast in the city is based on all-day observations. Also, the detection system used by our state is one of the most advanced in the world, Mila explained to the sisters blissfully. Jade and Julia responded with charming smiles. Ah, right, Miss Brown. You're in charge of work relating to weather forecasting in the city, right? Having no resistance to Jade and Julia's charm, Mila couldn't help but give them confirmation happily. With Jade and Julia continually chiming in, the atmosphere of the picnic became even more lively. Initially, Noah tried to stay cool by putting on a poker face. Yet, since it was his first time having a picnic in the wild, he became elated as well as it went on. After all, Noah, who successfully transformed into a human, was merely a child. On the other hand, Snowflake could hardly stay still. In the middle of its meal, it crawled onto the meadow and began rolling around. It first circled Jacob and Grandma meaninglessly, and it then suddenly took dozens of strides forward, jumping at the butterflies that were lingering on the flowers close by. Since Snowflake was so full of energy and really cute, the other young girls who were also having picnics on the site couldn't help but wave it over. Feeling no shame, Snowflake answered their calls immediately and ran over, while sticking out its tongue, jumped into the arms of those girls and began eating the ham sausages in their hands. Snowflake, Jacob shouted as he pretended to be mad. Abruptly, Snowflake jumped up and quickly returned to Jacob's side. Snowflake, all you know is to hang out with other girls, Sophie playfully scolded, while she hugged Snowflake firmly with one arm, locking onto its neck with the other, leaving it no way to escape again. Snowflake struggled desperately in Sophie's arms and let out little barks. After the picnic, Sophie went for a walk in the company of Mila, and Jacob went fishing by the small river with Walter. Walter and Mila had long buried themselves in their research and had been negligent in their communications with their son. Today was an excellent opportunity for them to strengthen their family bond. In the shade of a willow tree, Walter and Jacob were seated side by side after throwing out their fishing lines hooked with baits. The sun was shining on the river, and the water reflected specks of silver sparkles. This is such a great day, Walter remarked as they settled down. Jacob looked at him. Walter turned his body around, trying to signal his point with a smile. So Jacob followed him and turned around as well. Not far from them, Mila was leading Sophie as they took a walk. Because of the perfect wind in the valley, Sophie's hair was flying with the wind. The scene looked straight out of the movie. On the other hand,
Jade and Julia were strolling through a small path between the flowers. Suddenly, they seemed to have touched on a sensitive topic. Jade began running away swiftly, and Julia chased after her with an angry face. In another direction, right next to the car, Kathy had put away the picnic blanket and was now leaning against a big tree and chatting with Grandma. With a spectacular jump, Snowflake caught the frisbee that Noah threw out with its mouth. Julia had now caught up with Jade, and they both fell on the ground, where there were a ton of flowers, as they continued to tease each other. Right next to the car, Kathy suddenly burst out laughing as she talked to Grandma. Looking up at the clouds in the sky, Sophie put her white hand on top of her forehead to shelter her from the sun, and she squinted her eyes slightly. Jacob slowly put back his glances. Jacob suddenly felt a pull and pulled up his fishing rod abruptly. While flopping, a silver carp weighing more than 2 pounds was dragged out of the river and landed on the grass behind Jacob. Walter drove the van back to the house by the beach with a car full of their family. A few fish were jumping around inside the water bucket at the back of the car. Walter hadn't taken Jacob out in a long time. Therefore, he was shocked to find that although he was once a skilled fisherman, he was no longer a match for his son. The warm sunlight shined through the window and brought in the fragrance of flowers. Mila leaned back in the passenger seat and looked at the road that was continuously changing ahead of her as she felt very relaxed. Because of their work, Walter and Mila rarely had any relaxing days like this. After they returned to the house, they had dinner together, and the house was bustling with noise and excitement. Then Jade and Julia had to return home, but Grandma urged them to stay for the night. "Jacob, give your room to Jade and Julia. You can sleep on the couch in the living room tonight." Grandma held Jade and Julia's hands and said to Jacob. Jacob put on a bitter face and said, "Okay, Grandma." "Grandma, we can't do that." Jade waved her hands immediately. "Why not?" Grandma put on a straight face and gave Jacob an order. "From now on, when Jade and Julia come to visit our house, you will sleep in the living room." "Yes, sir," Jacob stood up straight and said. It was evident that Grandma loved Jade and Julia more than she loved and cared about Jacob. Also, Grandma cared about Noah way more than Jacob, as well since the latter was a lot younger. Jacob, who used to be Grandma's greatest treasure, started to fall in the ranks in Grandma's heart after Sophie, Kathy, Noah, Jade, and Julia arrived. Sophie wanted to stay in Jacob's room. However, after she learned that Jade and Julia were going to take over Jacob's room for the night, she changed her mind and decided to stay in Grandma's room instead. Since it was getting late, everyone went to their rooms to get some rest. Kathy sat in her room and cultivated the chi refinement route. After running the nature essence through her body 16 times, she opened her eyes slowly. The entire house was quiet, except for the noises of the sea waves coming in regularly. Kathy stretched her body, walked to the door, and opened it quietly. The couch in the living room was empty, because at this moment, Jacob was at the front entrance of the North Atlantic Dragon Palace.
The defense walls all around the Dragon Palace were full of arm-sized cracks and big holes. Even the tiles on top of the gate were slanted and shattered. Jacob could imagine how intense the battle must have been. From the bottom of the sea, that was a few thousand meters below the surface, a dozen hurricanes were created and even almost struck the coast that was more than a dozen miles away. The intensity must have been insane. "Who's there?" Jacob appeared to caught the attention of the patrolling soldiers of the North Atlantic. Forgive me for being rude. I didn't know that it was you, Prince." The leading soldier bowed his head as he saw Jacob. "How was the situation last night?" Jacob asked. "Last night, the soldiers of our North Atlantic were motivated, and we guarded the palace and fought off all the invading enemies with the help of the Grand Protection Array formations," the chief in golden armor replied. Jacob saw a new scar on this chief's face and thought that the North Atlantic must have suffered some losses. However, if North Atlantic suffered some losses, South Atlantic must have suffered more casualties. Are the elders all right? Elder Frank, Elder Liam, and Elder Kayla. Are they okay? By looking at the soldiers' expressions, Jacob guessed that Draken and Helen were both fine. Therefore, he directly asked about the elders. A few elders were... Unfortunately. The chief slightly raised his hands as his eyes got a bit red. Then he continued. However, the elders that the prince mentioned are all in good shape. After hearing the second half of the sentence, Jacob was a bit relieved. This time, both the dragon clans fought against each other to death. Both sides had started a deadly feud and had sacrificed elders. Although Jacob wasn't here on the battlefield, he could sense the intensity of the war by observing the condition of the collapsed gate and defense walls, as well as the extreme sea condition. The elders of South Atlantic self-detonated their own Dragon Corps to destroy the Grand Protection Array formation of the North Atlantic Dragon Palace. On the other hand, the elders of North Atlantic dashed into the army of the South Atlantic Dragon Clan and died in battle. The road of cultivation wasn't as peaceful as it seemed on the surface. It was filled with danger. Jacob truly understood it at this moment. He also understood the reason why some elders of North Atlantic asked Draken to sever ties with him. Even though the South Atlantic Dragon Clan faced many setbacks and experienced a drastic decrease in their overall strength the last several months, his dying beast could still take a massive bite out of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan. Lead me inside and show me around, Jacob said. As you wish, Prince. The chief turned around and led Jacob through the broken gate of the Dragon Palace. Most of the buildings were in good shape, except for the tiles on top of the palaces. Jacob guessed that the residual force of the used treasures damaged them. Judging from this, Jacob guessed that South Atlantic's army and elders failed to enter the interior of the North Atlantic Dragon Palace, and the main battlefield was located outside the defense walls. It was important to know that the families of the elders and soldiers of North Atlantic were living inside the Dragon Palace. If South Atlantic's army broke through, the results would be catastrophic. I can't go any further inside, Prince. The chief, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped. Each patrolling chief had areas that they were responsible for, and they were only allowed to walk in those areas when they were on duty. This chief was responsible for looking after the area around the inside and the outside of the city gate. Oh, please continue with your job then. Jacob nodded respectfully as he said to that chief. Then he walked toward the main palace with heavy steps as he tried to find Draken. The North Atlantic Dragon Clan and the South Atlantic Dragon Clan opposed each other due to the power struggle between them. However, there was a subtle balance between them, and nothing overboard occurred. The fact that Jacob destroyed half of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace pushed them over the line and triggered them, causing a full-on battle between the two clans. If they sacrificed Jacob, the whole situation would have been solved more peacefully. However, with Darius's return, he firmly decided to clear the situation in the toughest way possible. The South Atlantic Dragon Palace fell in the process, and their army was almost completely wiped out. The North Atlantic Dragon Palace, on the other hand, also lost a lot of soldiers and elders. This isn't your fault. A loud voice sounded behind Jacob. Jacob turned around and saw Darius, who was dressed in a clean suit, walking towards him. Sir, Jacob saluted. In this world, war is the last resort, but it's also a tool that is necessary to restore order. We must always be prepared for it, Darius said as he stood in front of Jacob and raised his thick white brows. Jacob forced a smile and nodded at him. Darius grabbed Jacob's shoulder with his steady hand and looked at the latter approvingly. When we were fighting against them in front of the Dragon Palace, you attacked their home base. That was great. What? Jacob was confused. Hank took his entire army out and left his Dragon Palace empty back in the South Atlantic. Then you took the opportunity and razed the South Atlantic Dragon Palace to the ground. I like your style of doing things and your thinking. Darius patted Jacob's shoulder forcefully. During the intense war between the North Atlantic Dragon Clan and the South Atlantic Dragon Clan last night, Jade and Julia went to South Atlantic to vent their anger because of what had happened to Jacob. They obliterated the South Atlantic Dragon Palace. A day after, the news was passed to Darius. He couldn't think of anyone who would have done that until he remembered that Jacob once destroyed half of the South Atlantic Dragon Palace. Therefore, he automatically assumed that it was Jacob's doing and was greatly pleased. What would Hank's expression be like when he led his defeated army back to the South Atlantic and saw the ruins of their Dragon Palace? With great joy, Darius thought that Jacob was reliable, ruthless, and well aware of the art of war. Darius was impressed by Jacob. He had never paid much attention to Jacob in the past, but now Darius started to observe Jacob carefully. With his careful observation, he was surprised to find that Jacob leveled up to the 4th level within a day. The glow of 3rd level was completely different from the glow of 4th level. Jacob had indeed reached the 4th level. Good. Draken is not good at other things, but he is good at picking people. Darius grabbed Jacob's shoulder firmly. Since Darius was at the top-tier 8th level, Jacob, who had just reached the 4th level, could not possibly break loose from Darius's hand. With such power, Jacob's shoulder bone was almost crushed. Darius suddenly changed his position. His hand was still grabbing onto Jacob's shoulder, but his arm was now wrapped around Jacob's neck. Then he pushed Jacob towards the main palace. The elders and soldiers who were patrolling inside the Dragon Palace looked at Jacob and Darius in shock. Even when the war between North Atlantic and South Atlantic got so intense, Kenneth still didn't come back. From now on, the 100,000 elite soldiers and 800,000 Marine soldiers are yours to command, Darius said. Darius and Jacob entered the main palace right after Darius's remark. Draken was sitting in the center of the main palace, listening to the core elders' reports. Helen was beside Draken, and she looked as tired as him. They all turned to Darius and bowed respectfully when he walked in. Darius waved his hand casually, signaling them to sit down. Father? Draken and Helen immediately stood up and bowed Darius after the elders. Darius nodded calmly. I ran into Jacob when he came over to check on the Dragon Palace. Draken and Helen looked at Jacob and felt warm-hearted. No matter how the North Atlantic Dragon Clan treated Jacob, he still worried about them. I want to make an announcement. Darius turned to more than a dozen core elders. They all looked at Darius with serious expressions. Every new king should bring his own ministers. However, the dragon cultivators could live for hundreds of years to thousands of years. These 7th and 8th level core elders all followed Darius in conquering the territory hundreds of years ago. These elders didn't dare to miss a single word from the old dragon king, Darius. Draken and Helen looked at Darius's broad shoulders nervously. The old dragon king had just returned to the country, and he immediately took control of the North Atlantic Dragon Palace. He started the war between the North and South Atlantic right away, and he wanted to make another announcement now. Jacob looked at Darius as well. He could almost guess what this announcement was going to be. The main palace became utterly silent. Jacob will take over Kenneth's position and become the commanding general of the army, Darius said word by word as his eyes shone brightly. All the elders' eyes opened wide as they gaped. Darius was giving all the military commanding power of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan to Jacob. In the past, the one who had such supreme military power was the 3rd son of Darius, Kenneth. He was Darius's favorite son as well, as the strongest cultivator of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan. Elder Liam and Elder Frank looked at each other in shock. They wondered if they had heard it wrong. Everybody knew the person who controlled the 900,000 soldiers of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, especially the 100,000 Imperial Guards who were the elite soldiers, could determine the fate of the clan. Jacob noticed the hints of hate on the core elders' faces when he walked into the main palace with Darius. In their opinion, if it weren't for Draken, who insisted on protecting Jacob, there wouldn't be this fierce war between the clans. This was a war that had caused the North Atlantic Dragon Clan tremendous damage over one night. They were able to understand Darius's action of pushing the South Atlantic Dragon Clan into the war with a fierce attitude, since the dignity and honor of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan had to be protected. However, these core elders couldn't understand why Darius was giving supreme military power to the outsider, Jacob. Compared with Kenneth, this Jacob doesn't have the ability or the strength. How on earth could he lead the army of North Atlantic? All sorts of thoughts appeared in the elders' minds. However, no one dared to question Darius. These core elders could go against Draken on some significant issues, but they would abide by anything Darius said. I hereby give him the title of the Commanding General of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, Darius said. Darius's announcement completely disregarded what Draken thought. Draken became an administrator instead of the decision-maker as soon as Darius came back to the North Atlantic Dragon Palace. Award him the Commanding General Gold Token, Darius said loud and clear. General Arthur was stunned for a second before rushing out of the main palace. Jacob stood where he was. He was wondering if he should accept or reject this offer. Neither option seemed to be appropriate, so he decided to keep quiet for now. General Arthur ran back into the main palace with his back hunched. Above his head, he held a dark gold square token in both of his hands. Darius picked the token up and put it on Jacob's hand. This token was left in the North Atlantic Dragon Palace by Kenneth before he went on his journey. By handing the token to Jacob in person, Darius took the military power of the North Atlantic Dragon Palace from Kenneth and gave it to Jacob. It symbolized that he was offering Jacob the position of Commanding General. All the purple-robed elders were so surprised that their eyes almost popped out. If it were Draken who handed Jacob the military power, these elders would have flipped the table. However, this was Darius's decision, so no one dared to oppose it. Jacob took a deep breath and looked at Darius with the heavy token in his hand, confused. General Arthur was in charge of the affairs inside the Dragon Palace. Since Draken lived more on land and Sophie was his only child, General Arthur barely had any influence. The purple-robed elders were the highest-leveled elders, but they functioned as cabinet members and provided the Dragon King with suggestions and advice and assisted with external affairs. However, no matter how senior they were, one person's power was still limited. However, the commanding general was in charge of almost 1 million soldiers and was the head of all military members. With the military power, Jacob had suddenly become the second person in charge under the Dragon King. He had truly become the second in command at North Atlantic. Announce the order, Darius said coldly. As you wish. General Arthur walked out of the main palace hastily to gather a few key chiefs for the announcement. Usually, Darius would need to pick a special day to promote Jacob to the commanding general position. Also, all the chiefs needed to be present for the ceremony. However, since there had been a war between the North Atlantic Dragon Clan and South Atlantic Dragon Clan, all the soldiers were busy patrolling their designated areas. Therefore, an official ceremony couldn't be planned. All the purple-robed elders in the main palace were witnesses, and the tokens symbolized the credential. Soon, The news of Jacob becoming the commanding general would be delivered to every single corner of North Atlantic's territory. Since Darius made the order, the purple-robed elders in the main palace didn't dare to show any disapproval. However, they weren't convinced. No matter what, Jacob couldn't be compared to Kenneth. Kenneth went through real battles to build up his name. He battled around the area of the Demon Sea and gained the North Atlantic Dragon Palace a lot of territories. He made significant contributions to expanding North Atlantic, and almost everyone in North Atlantic had respect for him. How on earth could Jacob lead the North Atlantic Army? In addition, the purple-robed elders fought against the South Atlantic Dragon Clan with Darius, who was like a god of slaughter last night, and they held against their enemies' fierce attacks and defended the North Atlantic Dragon Palace. They fought with the last drop of their blood so that the North Atlantic Dragon Palace could win the war, but they still suffered a tremendous amount of damage. Where was Jacob at the time of the battle, they thought. However, no one could say that they were against this decision when looking at Darius's bright eyes. Draken and Helen glimpsed at each other, confused as well. Elder Kayla clenched her fist tightly and frowned. She couldn't see through Darius's intention. "Carry on." Darius waved again and walked towards the door. He patted Jacob's shoulder as he walked by him. A strong power entered Jacob's shoulder, and he was forced to dash a few steps ahead and sprang out of the main palace. "Come with me." Jacob heard Darius's calm and cold voice in his ear. Silently, Jacob followed Darius to the back of the palace. As the overlord of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, Darius lived in a fancy palace. After passing 4 large, spired pavilions, crossing a white bridge, Jacob stepped onto a small training field that was paved by dozens of top-tier spirit stones and had a width of 3 meters. The square-shaped spirit stones that had a length and a width of 3 meters looked very smooth. Jacob found that the nature essence in his body was activated when he stepped onto the stones. He felt refreshed. Living with dragon cores, the dragon cultivators were able to absorb nature essence faster than the human cultivators, and thus didn't need spirit stones to help them cultivate. However, only the super-rich North Atlantic Dragon Clan could afford to pave the ground before the palace where the overlord of North Atlantic lived with such huge top-tier spirit stones. This luxurious use of spirit stones would astonish the cultivators on Fifth Heaven. The first time when he came to the North Atlantic Dragon Palace, General Arthur had showed him around the palace. However, he didn't bring Jacob to this section. It was because Darius's palace was a restricted place, even when he wasn't living there. 4 guards in black stood at the gate of the palace, not moving a muscle. Jacob looked at the 4 guards and sensed a unique aura from them. From his experience with Susan and the twins, he could tell that the 4 ordinary-looking guards were all masters on the 8th level. They were Darius's bodyguards and his trusted servants. They didn't glance at Jacob. Instead, they looked at their surroundings as if they had merged with nature. Darius stepped forward and led Jacob into his palace, which gave Jacob a deeper understanding of luxury. In the grand hall that had an area of thousands of square meters, there stood 18 coiling golden dragon beams, and golden dragon decorations were everywhere. A golden dragon throne and a golden screen stood in the middle of the grand hall. It was a magnificent sight. With a wave of Darius's hand, the 4 guards in black who were standing outside the palace immediately closed the doors. The sound of the doors closing echoed through the palace. Darius walked over and sat on the golden throne, looking down at Jacob. With no officials or elders standing by his side, Jacob stood in the middle of the grand hall and felt enormous pressure as he looked at Darius. "Grandpa," Jacob said after a moment of hesitation. He planned on addressing Darius as Sir, but he changed his mind in the middle and called Darius Grandpa instead. After all, Sophie addressed his grandmother as Grandma, and he thought he'd do the same. Darius's expression didn't change. Jacob continued, I can't take the position of the commanding general. While he spoke, Jacob walked to Darius with a token in his hand. Considering the situation at the time, Jacob didn't refuse Darius on the spot, but he had to return the token to Darius in private. Sitting on the throne, Darius gave a cold snort. A surge of sharp energy shot towards Jacob's forehead, and his powerful energy rushed into his spiritual senses instantly, forcing him to back off 3 steps with a blank mind, as if he lost consciousness for 3 seconds. At this critical moment, Jacob desperately circulated the nature essence through his meridians to regain a clear mind. He sensed a ton of danger. If Jacob were only at the 3rd level, he would have instantly collapsed. You have indeed reached the 4th level, Darius said lightly. Jacob was a bit mad that Darius used such violent method to test his realm. If he hadn't reached the 4th level, he might have died. Since you've reached the 4th level, I can use the bodily filling technique, Darius continued. Suddenly, he crossed his hands and reached out for Jacob. Standing in the grand hall, Jacob suddenly felt a powerful surge of nature essence coming at him from all directions. Jacob wasn't sure what this old man was up to. However, since he was like Kenneth, he must hold little to no regard for mortals as well. Not wanting to be subdued without a fight, Jacob released his 4th level sword energies. Heaven-Earth Array Formation. The 320 sword energies formed 3 shields and guarded his vital body parts. Interesting. Darius's force suddenly increased. Like seawater that was going at him from all directions, Jacob was instantly engulfed by powerful nature essence. He couldn't even block it a little with his sword energies. Having fought with Tom, Jacob knew the fierce power of a 7th level master. Now he understood the vast difference between the 8th level and the 7th level. His sword array formation that could release the power of 5th level couldn't hold up for even 1 second before the power of 8th level. Suddenly his feet left the ground, and he was suspended mid-air by the powerful nature essence. 2 iron-like hands caught his shoulders. Jacob felt that all of his acupoints were blocked, and he couldn't even shout. All his nature essence poured out as if a dam was opened. Immediately, a surge of more powerful nature essence poured into his body through the acupoint in his shoulder. This pure and powerful nature essence rushed into Jacob's narrow meridians, causing his acupoints to redden and swell. The nature essence was filling Jacob's body by force. It completely disregarded Jacob's resistance. With the sword Shadow Scroll, Jacob had cultivated all 5 elemental essences. However, Darius poured a vast amount of water elemental essence into Jacob's body. If Jacob had not reached the 4th level and tempered his body would have exploded to the cramming method. The aggressive nature essence instantly opened 3 openings in Jacob's dragon core. With your steady foundation and mild temperament, you'll be a great cultivator with bright prospects. However, you're courageous, but not domineering, which means that you can't be a successful king or lord, Darius said while he transferred his nature essence into Jacob's body. In Jacob's body, the sword Shadow Scroll was desperately turning the water elemental essence into other 4 elements. Draken is ambitious, but lacks fierceness. Kenneth is courageous and fierce, but lacks a strategic mind. Edward is an unrivaled strategist, but his body type prevents him from cultivating, and he can only ensure riches for his descendants, Darius said in a measured tone as he continued to pour nature essence into Jacob's body. Will my clan fall like this? Draken is a good king, but he will want to step down someday. Soph is impulsive and thus is not fit for holding power. Kenneth pursues the ultimate peak of cultivation without any wishes to take the throne. Edward and his line of descendants are immersed in mortal luxuries, and their dragon mark has begun to dim. I'm old now, so who can steer this ship named North Atlantic? Suddenly, the nature essence surged out of Darius' palms at a faster speed. The situation of North Atlantic is precarious, and I don't want someone else to take the token as the commanding general. Although your cultivation strength is weak, your foundation is firm, and you're loyal to North Atlantic with a pure heart. I'd rather hand the position of the commanding general to a less powerful man than to potential evil and ambitious schemers. Before Kenneth returns, you can lead the soldiers of North Atlantic for me, Darius shouted with shiny eyes. Jacob felt like he was under torture, but he understood Darius's words. Although he had no experience in leading troops, his position was closest to Draken and Kenneth. Thus, he was the safest candidate for the position. My life is coming to an end, and I plan to pass my cultivation strength to Kenneth so that my 1,000 years of cultivation wouldn't go to waste. However, he is gone and didn't even come back at the life and death moment of the North Atlantic Dragon clan. With Draken's talent and ability, it'll be a waste to pass my strength to him. Soph's foundation isn't stable, and her realm is too low, Darius continued. Jacob, whose body was swelling up, was astonished by Darius's words. He now realized that Darius was not testing him, but rather transferring all of the 1,000 years of cultivation strength to him. Darius started the war between North Atlantic and South Atlantic to force Kenneth to show himself. But the plan failed. This meant that Kenneth must have gone to a faraway land. Darius knew that he must take the opportunity to completely defeat the South Atlantic Dragon clan while it was in its decline. He knew this was his only chance, and he couldn't miss it. I've cultivated for 1,000 years, but due to my many killings and intense murderous spirit, I couldn't break through to the heavenly dragon realm. However, after ruling the North Atlantic for 1,000 years, I have no regrets in life. This is what I deserve. Darius' hands shook slightly. Feeling the pressure lighten, Jacob gained his balance and turned to Darius. Compared with his energetic look when he just returned from abroad, Darius now looked very old. While he was transferring the nature essence into Jacob's body, Darius sensed weak but miraculous nature essence hovered around Jacob's dragon core, suppressing all the powerful nature essence which was beyond Jacob's capabilities. This was a note left in Jacob's body by a grand master whose power far surpassed the 8th level, and this note sealed up the 1,000 years of cultivation strength that Darius gave Jacob. Darius knew that Jacob got this note from somewhere else, but he didn't point it out. If Kenneth got this cultivation strength, it probably would help him break through to the heavenly dragon realm. Now that was stored in Jacob's body, it was hard to say whether it would be useful or not in the future. Hank will believe that I'm still alive with powerful cultivation strength, so he'll be cautious. We must keep what happened here a secret. Darius took out a black longsword from an ancient storage ring, and he stared at Jacob as he said, "You must personally hand the sword to Kenneth when he comes back." With both hands, Jacob took the icy black longsword, which was made from mystic iron. Suddenly, Darius turned into a black dragon, sweeping across the grand hall. After flying around for 2 rotations, this dragon shattered and turned into sparkling light dots. Then, these light dots formed a dragon soul that was only half a meter long. The fierce black dragon soul rushed into the black longsword, turning the blades extremely sharp. Black Dragon Spike. The intense murder spirit, which had been accumulating for 1,000 years, instantly spread to the surface of the Black Dragon Spike. The 4 guards in black, who were outside of the palace, suddenly pushed the door open and rushed in. When they saw the black longsword in Jacob's hands, their faces turned to sadness before kneeling on the ground. "Dragon King," they cried. "Dragon King!" Their voices echoed in the spacious palace. Darius's dragon's presence still lingered around the pillars of the palace. However, he had transferred all his cultivation strength to Jacob, and his essence dragon soul had merged into the black longsword in Jacob's hands. From the top of the palace rose a surge of black energy, which shot into the air. The surrounding seawater boiled, while the black energy rushed out of the ocean and shot up into the clouds. The black energy gradually vanished. A great, fierce hero died. This strange phenomenon attracted the notice of the nearby soldiers, and they came over to investigate. The 4 guards suddenly turned into 4 black light beams and flew out of the palace. "The Dragon King is cultivating. Anyone trespassing will be killed." Standing in all 4 directions of the palace, the 4 guards yelled at the same time. Hundreds of soldiers who had been rushing over immediately stopped their steps. The palace gradually quieted down while the soldiers hurried back. "Tell the king that the old Dragon King is leaving," the 4 guards shouted together as they stood on the 4 corners of the roof. Then, without any hesitation, they chased after the black energy, which was gradually disappearing in the high sky, and turned into beams of black light. "We are your servants, Lord, and we will stay with the old Dragon King all our lives." Together with the remaining presence of Darius, they flew towards the west. Doesn't matter what happened, they would stay in Darius's mansion in the UK to create the illusion that he was still alive. In this way, the forces that were coveting the fortunes of the North Atlantic would stay in their territories. Otherwise, they would copy the South Atlantic Dragon Clan, trying to attack North Atlantic and seize their properties that had been accumulating for thousands of years. Studying in the center of the palace, Jacob hesitated for a few seconds before injecting a trace of nature essence into the black dragon spike. The tip of the black dragon spike released a black shockwave that shot out of the wide open gates before hiding a palace in the distance. A corner of that palace was cut off, containing Darius's 1,000-year dragon soul. This weapon was very fierce. Meanwhile, a chilling, murderous spirit crept along the handle of the sword to Jacob's heart. With black dragon spike in his hand, Jacob took several steps back before falling into the golden throne. Containing the powerful murderous spirit that had been accumulating for 1,000 years, the black dragon spike had a violent impact on the user, and not everyone could handle such a backlash. Jacob had just injected a trace of nature essence into it as a test and caused such great damage. If more nature essence was injected into it, the murderous spirit would cause more damage to the cultivator who used it. Jacob finally understood why Darius wanted him to give this weapon to Kenneth. It was because only a pinnacle master like Kenneth could control such a fierce weapon. When Kenneth took this weapon, he would find out the truth about the death of Darius, and the secret would be out. To ensure the temporary safety of the North Atlantic, Darius gave up on resting in peace in the Dragon Tomb. A heroic feeling rose in Jacob's heart. He once thought that Darius was fierce and overbearing, but now he thought of him as a strong man with heroic achievements. Jacob carefully put away the black dragon spike before standing up from the throne and walking out of the palace. It was very quiet, and the entire North Atlantic Dragon Palace was illuminated by a red light. Jacob passed the training field paved with spirit stones, and past the white bridge, arriving at the grand hall where Draken was staying. Sitting behind a desk, Draken was looking at something under the candlelight, while Elder Liam, Elder Frank, and General Arthur were quietly standing on both sides of him. "What happened?" Draken looked up at Jacob and asked. "The old Dragon King, Grandpa went back. After some hesitation, Jacob reported. Yeah, they've reported it to me. Draken nodded and put the thing in his hand on one side of the table before asking Jacob. I think my father has a deeper meaning in handing the position of the commanding general to you, right? Grandpa asked me to cultivate more and take care of Soph, Jacob said. Okay, Draken nodded again. After the war with South Atlantic, I understand why he wanted to go back. Jacob remained silent. Obviously, Draken would never imagine that Darius had disappeared into nature. In the eyes of Draken, Darius was as fierce, bad-tempered, and controlling as before. Is Susan still in the Dragon Palace? Jacob asked. She's still resting in the Dragon Palace. Draken turned to look at General Arthur. General Arthur, please take Jacob to her. General Arthur walked forward. Prince, this way, please. Sir, please don't stay up too late, Jacob said to Draken. With a smile, Draken gave him a small wave before lowering his head to continue working. With his haunched back, General Arthur led Jacob to Elder Kayla's palace. Prince, congratulations on your promotion to the commanding general. General Arthur turned his head and congratulated him. Jacob laughed bitterly, not sure how to answer him. Commanding general sounded magnificent, but he had been forced into this position by Darius. I understand the old Dragon King's intention, but you must be careful, Prince. General Arthur continued. Be careful? Jacob looked at him in confusion. Since the old Dragon King personally appointed you to be the commanding general, no one from the Dragon Palace dared to object. However, the outside... General Arthur paused for a few seconds before continuing. Now that you are the commanding general of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, the leader of 1,000,000 soldiers. While General Arthur beat around the bushes, Jacob gradually understood his point. He was the commanding general of the North Atlantic Dragon Clan, but he didn't live in the Dragon Palace, and thus was not under the protection of the troops. This time, although the South Atlantic Dragon Clan was almost destroyed, they wouldn't admit defeat. Darius put Jacob in the position of the commanding general to prevent internal turmoil, but at the same time, his decision brought Jacob more danger. Although the palaces and the soldiers of the South Atlantic Dragon Clan were destroyed, it still had quite a few 7th and 8th level cultivators. However, from your look, I see that you've reached a higher realm, General Arthur continued. Thank you, General Arthur, Jacob answered politely. He still remembered that when he first came into the North Atlantic Dragon Palace, he asked General Arthur about how to cultivate the Spirit Concentration Scroll. Only a short time had passed, and now he had reached the 4th level. The old Dragon King is fierce and hot-tempered, but he's a rare cultivator. If you can get some tips from him, you'll reach the 5th level very soon, General Arthur continued. Jacob looked at General Arthur and suddenly found him unfathomable. After all, General Arthur had worked under 2 Dragon Kings, and he was very familiar with the mindset of his bosses. When General Arthur and Jacob entered the gates of Elder Kayla's palace, the female disciple on duty immediately went inside to report to Susan. Senior Susan asked you to come in, she said to Jacob as she dashed out. Jacob walked into the garden while General Arthur waited for him at the gate. Walking under the moon and past the flowers in the quiet palace, Jacob suddenly felt nervous. During the war between North Atlantic and South Atlantic, Jacob got a little worried about Susan, who was resting in the Dragon Palace. But from the looks of it, she wasn't directly involved in the conflict between the 2 dragon clans. Come in, Susan's clear voice sounded from the inside after he knocked. Carefully, Jacob pushed open the door and entered. He found Susan sitting cross-legged on the bed and cultivating with her eyes closed. Commanding General of the North Atlantic, what brought you here in the middle of the night? Susan asked without opening her eyes. Jacob smiled helplessly and replied, I just wanted to come and see how you were doing. I fully recovered my cultivation strength, and I'm going back to the Dragon God Shrine to report the conflict between North Atlantic and South Atlantic tomorrow. Susan slowly opened her eyes and said. Jacob nodded, since he knew it was her duty. After all, the war between the North and the South Atlantic Dragon Clan underwater almost disturbed the mortals in the nearby city, and the Dragon God Shrine needed to know the details of it. As the regional inspector of the city, Susan must give them an explanation. What happens when a cultivator's lifespan is all used up? Jacob asked, after a moment of silence. The higher the realm cultivator has, the longer they live. The dragon cultivators on the 8th level and human cultivators at the top tier Nascent Soul Realm can live for about 1,000 years. Then they must follow the law of the life cycle, unless they can reach the heavenly dragon realm or the soul formation realm to live as long as the universe, and shine as brightly as the sun and the moon, Susan said. How about extending one's life with godly pills? Jacob continued to ask. The rare fruits in nature probably can extend the lives of some cultivators, but for those whose ages have reached the limit, no elixirs can keep. Only through hard cultivation and reaching the heavenly dragon realm can one live permanently and become the true masters of the world, Susan said lightly.